There is a moment that happens to almost everyone, usually late at night, usually when the house is quiet and there is nothing left to distract you. You are lying there, replaying a decision. Maybe it was something you said in a meeting. Maybe it was a text message you sent, and then immediately wished you could pull back out of the air. Maybe it was something bigger. A job you didn't take. A relationship you didn't end. A move you didn't make. And your mind, instead of letting you rest, drags you through it again and again, showing you every possible way it could have gone differently, every alternate version of the choice you already made, or the choice you still haven't made. This is not thinking. This is not planning. This is not preparation. This is overthinking, and it is quietly running your life. Here is the part almost nobody tells you. Overthinking does not feel like a flaw. It feels like responsibility. It feels like diligence. It feels like the mature, careful, adult thing to do. You tell yourself that you are simply being thorough, that you are simply weighing your options, that a good decision deserves careful consideration. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But underneath it, something else is happening. You are not actually gathering more information anymore. You are not actually getting closer to clarity. You are spinning in place, burning energy, burning time, and mistaking motion for progress. The tragedy of overthinking is that it disguises itself as intelligence, while it slowly dismantles your ability to act. This is not a story about being lazy or unmotivated. Overthinkers are usually some of the most capable, most conscientious people you will ever meet. They care. They want to get it right. They are afraid of hurting someone, afraid of wasting money, afraid of wasting years, afraid of being the person who made the wrong call and has to live with it. That fear is not weakness. It is evidence that you take your life seriously. But somewhere along the way, that seriousness got hijacked. Instead of protecting you, it started controlling you. Instead of helping you choose well, it started preventing you from choosing at all. By the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why your mind does this to you. What is actually happening inside your brain when you spiral through the same decision 50 times without landing anywhere. And more importantly, you are going to walk away with a real system. Not vague encouragement, not empty affirmations, but an actual structure you can use the next time you feel yourself sinking into that familiar quicksand of what if and maybe and I don't know. You are going to learn how to trust yourself again. Not blind trust, not reckless trust, but the kind of grounded self-trust that lets a person make a decision, live with it, adjust if needed, and keep moving forward instead of standing frozen at every fork in the road. Because here is the truth underneath all of this. The people who seem to move through life with confidence, the people who make decisions and don't torture themselves over every possible outcome, they are not smarter than you. They do not have access to some secret certainty that you don't have. Nobody has certainty. Nobody ever gets to see the future before they choose. The difference is that they have learned how to act without it. And you are about to learn the same thing. Think for a moment about how much of your life has already been quietly shaped by decisions you avoided rather than decisions you made. The conversation you didn't start because you kept rehearsing it instead of having it. The opportunity that closed while you were still weighing it against alternatives that never actually existed anywhere but in your head. The version of yourself you could have become a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. If you had simply trusted the instinct you already had instead of drowning it in endless reconsideration. This is not meant to make you feel guilty. Guilt is just another form of overthinking wearing a different mask, and it will not help you here. This is meant to make you honest about the actual cost of the pattern, because you cannot change something you have not fully admitted is happening. What you are about to go through is not a collection of feel-good ideas meant to be nodded along to and then forgotten. It is a structured breakdown of exactly how overthinking operates, chapter by chapter, trap by trap, followed by the specific mental tools that dismantle each one. Some of what you hear will feel uncomfortable, because it will describe patterns you recognize a little too clearly. That discomfort is useful. It means you are finally looking directly at something you have spent a long time looking around instead of at. Stay with it. By the final chapter, the goal is not simply that you understand overthinking intellectually. The goal is that the next time you feel that familiar spiral beginning, some part of you will recognize it immediately, name it, and choose differently. Chapter 1. The Overthinking Trap. Let's start by naming what is actually happening, because you cannot fix something you refuse to look directly at. Overthinking is not caution. Caution has a stopping point. Caution gathers the information it needs and then makes a call. Overthinking has no stopping point, because overthinking was never really about the decision in the first place. It was about trying to feel safe. And the problem with using thought as a shield against fear is that fear cannot be outthought. You can turn a decision over in your mind 10,000 times, and it will not become safer. It will only become heavier. Picture two people standing at the exact same fork in the road, facing the exact same choice, with the exact same information available to them. One of them looks at the options, feels the discomfort of uncertainty, and picks a direction anyway. The other stands there, and stands there, and stands there, asking the same questions in slightly different words, hoping that if they just think about it long enough, one of the paths will light up and announce itself as the correct one. It never does. Life does not work that way. There is no moment where uncertainty fully evaporates and leaves you with a guarantee. The first person accepts this and moves. The second person refuses to accept it, and in refusing, they do not eliminate the uncertainty. They simply trade it for something worse, which is stagnation. This is the core of the overthinking trap. It promises safety and delivers paralysis. It tells you that if you just keep analyzing, you will eventually reach a point of complete confidence, and from that place, you will finally be able to act without fear. But that point does not exist. It is a mirage. You can walk toward it forever and never arrive, because it was never a real destination to begin with. All the while, real time is passing. Real opportunities are closing. Real moments that required a decision are quietly deciding themselves, usually in the worst possible way. Because doing nothing is itself a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. What makes this trap so effective is that it feels productive from the inside. Every time you run the scenario again, every time you list the pros and cons one more time, every time you imagine how a friend might react, or how a stranger might judge you, it feels like you are doing something. Your mind rewards you with a small sense of control, a small sense of diligence. But strip away that feeling and look at the results. Are you actually closer to a decision than you were an hour ago? Usually not. Usually you are just more tired, more anxious, and more convinced that this decision is more dangerous than it actually is, simply because you have now spent so much emotional energy on it that it has grown in importance far beyond its real weight. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from overthinking, and it is different from physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of a mind that has been sprinting in place. You wake up already worn down by a decision you haven't even made yet. You carry it into conversations that have nothing to do with it. It sits in the back of your head during dinner, during work, during moments that were supposed to be restful. And the cruel irony is that the longer you carry it unresolved, the harder it becomes to finally set it down, because now you have not only the original decision to make, but also the weight of everything you told yourself about how important and dangerous and irreversible it supposedly is. Understand this clearly. The trap is not the decision itself. Decisions are neutral. They are simply forks in a path. The trap is the belief that more thinking will eventually produce more certainty, when in reality, past a certain point, more thinking only produces more noise. The signal you actually need, the sense of what feels right, what aligns with your values, what you can live with, that signal gets buried under all the extra analysis. You do not need more thinking. You need less noise so you can hear what you already know. Consider how this trap tends to escalate. It rarely starts with something enormous. It usually starts small, a minor decision that somehow refuses to resolve itself. What to say in a text message, which option to pick from a menu, whether to bring up a small disagreement with a friend on their own. These moments seem harmless, almost laughably small to be spending so much energy on. But the mind that practices overthinking on small decisions is training itself, building the neural habit of hesitation and reconsideration. And that habit does not stay contained to minor choices. It generalizes. It grows. Before long, the same hesitation that once applied to a text message is now applying itself to a career move, a relationship, a financial decision, because the brain has learned, through repetition, that this is simply how decisions are handled. Slowly, anxiously, with endless internal debate. This is why the overthinking trap deserves to be taken seriously even in its smallest forms. It is not really about any single decision. It is about the pattern underneath all of them, the reflex that gets triggered the moment uncertainty appears, regardless of how much is actually at stake. Left unaddressed, that reflex will not stay confined to the unimportant corners of your life. It will eventually reach into the decisions that matter most, the ones with real consequences for your career, your relationships, your sense of who you are becoming. And by then, the habit will be deeply grooved, difficult to notice, let alone interrupt. Recognizing the trap early, in its smallest and most ordinary appearances, is what makes it possible to catch it before it grows into something that controls the biggest decisions of your life. Chapter 2. Why your mind won't let you decide. To beat overthinking, you have to understand that it is not a personal weakness. It is a survival mechanism, running out of context. Your brain was not built for the modern world of endless choices and long-term abstract decisions. It was built for a much older, much simpler world, one where the biggest threats were immediate and physical. In that world, hesitation before a genuinely dangerous situation could keep you alive. A brain that paused to consider every possible danger before acting had an advantage over a brain that rushed in carelessly. That caution circuitry, the one designed to protect you from wolves and cliffs and hostile strangers, is the exact same circuitry that now activates when you are trying to decide whether to send an email or change careers or end a relationship that isn't working. The problem is that this circuitry cannot tell the difference between a decision that could genuinely harm you and a decision that simply feels uncomfortable. To your nervous system, uncertainty itself registers as danger. It does not matter whether the uncertain thing is a physical threat or an emotional one, whether it's a real risk or an imagined one. The alarm system fires the same way. So, when you sit there trying to decide something as simple as which job offer to accept, part of your brain is treating that decision with the same intensity it would use if you were standing at the edge of a cliff. That is why the anxiety feels so disproportionate to the actual stakes. Your body is not responding to the reality of the decision. It is responding to the sensation of not knowing. And not knowing has always felt like danger to a brain built for survival. There is also a specific bias at play here, one that psychologists refer to as loss aversion. In simple terms, the pain of losing something is felt far more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. This means that when you are making a decision, your mind naturally gives more weight to everything that could go wrong than to everything that could go right. You are not being irrational when you feel more pulled toward the potential downsides than the potential upsides. You are experiencing a very old, very deeply wired bias that once helped your ancestors avoid catastrophic mistakes, but now mostly just keeps you stuck, rearranging the same worries in your head. Add to this the fact that your brain is wired to seek closure and pattern, to want things to resolve cleanly, and you get a perfect storm. An unresolved decision is an open loop, and open loops are uncomfortable to the human mind. So your brain keeps returning to that loop, trying to close it, except it doesn't have enough certainty to close it the way it wants to. So it just keeps circling. Each pass through the loop feels like an attempt to solve the problem, but it is actually just repetition. You are not adding new information. You are re-experiencing the same discomfort and calling it thinking. Here is something important to sit with. The fact that overthinking feels so intense, so urgent, so necessary, does not mean it is accurate. Intensity is not the same as truth. Your nervous system can be screaming that something is dangerous while the actual situation is mild and manageable. Learning to separate the volume of a feeling from the accuracy of that feeling is one of the most valuable skills you can build, not just for decision-making, but for your entire relationship with your own mind. Just because a thought arrives loudly and urgently does not mean it deserves to be obeyed. Once you understand that overthinking is your ancient survival wiring misfiring in a modern context, something shifts. You stop treating the spiral as evidence that the decision truly is dangerous, and you start treating it as what it actually is: an outdated alarm system doing its job a little too enthusiastically. That reframe alone will not solve everything, but it changes your relationship to the discomfort. You can start to notice the spiral beginning and think, there is my old wiring again, rather than believing every warning it gives you as if it were fact. There is another layer worth understanding here, which is the role that stress and depletion play in amplifying this entire process. A tired, overstimulated, chronically stressed brain is far more likely to fall into overthinking than a rested, regulated one, because the same resources needed for calm, deliberate reasoning are also the resources drained by poor sleep, constant notifications, and unresolved daily stress. This is why a decision that feels manageable in the morning after a good night's sleep can feel utterly overwhelming at 11 at night after a long, draining day. The decision itself has not changed. Your nervous system's capacity to handle uncertainty has changed. Many people mistake this shift in internal state for a shift in the actual difficulty of the decision, and they end up making the situation feel far more dire than it really is, simply because they are trying to think clearly from a depleted, dysregulated place. This matters because it means part of the solution to overthinking is not purely mental, it is physiological. Learning to recognize when you are trying to make a decision from a depleted state and having the discipline to step back rather than push forward is itself a skill worth building. A decision made from calm is fundamentally different from a decision made from exhaustion. Even when the external facts are identical, the exhausted mind reaches for worst-case scenarios because it does not have the resources to hold nuance. The rested mind can consider a range of outcomes without being flooded by the most catastrophic one. Understanding this gives you a practical lever. When you notice the spiral intensifying, one of the first questions worth asking is not what should I do, but how depleted am I right now? And would this decision look different to me after real rest? Chapter 3. The Analysis Loop. The first of the specific traps you need to recognize by name is what we will call the analysis loop. And if you are someone who overthinks, you already know this one intimately, even if you have never named it before. The analysis loop is the pattern of telling yourself that before you can decide, you need just a little more information. One more article, one more opinion, one more comparison, one more conversation with someone who might have insight. It feels responsible on the surface, because gathering information genuinely is part of making a good decision. The problem is that the analysis loop does not know when to stop, because it was never actually trying to reach a stopping point. It was trying to avoid the discomfort of committing. Think about how this shows up in real life. Someone is trying to decide whether to leave a job. They research the new opportunity extensively. They talk to friends about it. They make lists. They research the company's reputation, its growth trajectory, its culture, its benefits. All of this seems thorough. But then, instead of reaching a decision, they start researching again. They read the same reviews from a different angle. They ask a different friend the same question they already asked 3 other friends. They are not uncovering new information anymore. They are simply repeating the search for certainty using slightly different inputs, hoping that this time, one of these searches will finally produce the feeling of complete confidence they are chasing. Here is the trap hidden inside the trap. The analysis loop convinces you that the reason you haven't decided yet is that you don't have enough information, when in reality, past a certain threshold, you already have enough information, and what you actually lack is the willingness to act without a guarantee. No amount of additional research will produce a guarantee, because guarantees about the future do not exist. You could research a decision for 10 years, and you would still be making a leap at the end of it, because the future is inherently unknown. All that extra research does is delay the leap while making you feel like you're being careful. There is a useful test for recognizing when you have crossed from genuine research into the analysis loop. Ask yourself honestly, is this new piece of information actually likely to change my decision? Or am I just looking for something, anything, that will make me feel more comfortable about a decision I have essentially already made in my gut. If you are honest with yourself, you will often find that you already know which direction you're leaning, and the ongoing research isn't informing that lean. It is simply postponing the moment where you have to act on it. The way out of the analysis loop is not to stop gathering information altogether. Information matters, and ignoring it recklessly is its own kind of mistake. The way out is to set a boundary around the information gathering phase before you begin it. Decide in advance what specific questions need answers, and decide in advance how much time or how many sources you will allow yourself before you move to a decision. This transforms an open-ended search, which can continue forever, into a contained task with a clear finish line. When the boundary is reached, you decide with what you have, because what you have is, in almost every case, already enough. It helps to remember that even experts, operating with far more information than you currently have, still face uncertainty. Skilled professionals in medicine, in business, in engineering, they all make consequential decisions without complete information, because complete information is not something reality offers anyone. What separates them from someone stuck in an analysis loop is not that they know more, it's that they have made peace with deciding under uncertainty, trusting their training, their judgment, and their ability to adjust course if new information later suggests they should. You can build that same trust in yourself, but only if you allow yourself to actually reach the point of decision instead of orbiting it endlessly. There is also a hidden cost to the analysis loop that most people never account for, which is the cost of the alternatives you are not exploring while you remain stuck, comparing the same 2 or 3 options over and over. Every hour spent circling an existing decision is an hour not spent living inside whichever option you eventually choose, gathering the real-world feedback that no amount of research could ever substitute for. Reading 100 reviews about a new city will never tell you as much as spending one afternoon actually walking through it. Reading endless articles about a new career path will never tell you as much as one real conversation with someone currently doing that work, or better yet, one small real step taken in that direction. At a certain point, research stops being the fastest route to clarity, and actual lived experience becomes the faster, more honest teacher. But you only gain access to that teacher once you stop circling and start moving. It is also worth acknowledging that the analysis loop often thrives on a particular kind of intelligence, the same intelligence that makes a person good at their job, good at solving problems, good at spotting flaws and risks that other people miss. That very capability, so useful in so many contexts, becomes a liability here, because a sharp mind can always generate one more angle, one more scenario, one more what-if, seemingly without end. If you are someone who has been told your whole life that you think carefully, that you consider things deeply, recognize that this same strength, unmanaged, is exactly what fuels the loop. The goal is not to think less sharply. The goal is to point that sharpness toward recognizing when enough information has been gathered, rather than allowing it to manufacture infinite new angles indefinitely. Chapter 4. The approval trap. The second trap is quieter than the analysis loop, and in some ways more dangerous, because it does not look like indecision from the outside. It looks like consultation. It looks like being thoughtful and considerate of other people's perspectives. But underneath it is something else entirely, a deep discomfort with making a choice that might not be universally approved of. We will call this the approval trap. and it shows up whenever you find yourself needing everyone around you to agree with your decision before you feel safe enough to make it. Here is how it typically unfolds. You are facing a decision, and instead of sitting with your own judgment, you immediately start polling the people around you. You ask your parents, you ask your partner, you ask a coworker, you ask an online forum full of strangers. On the surface, this looks like healthy information gathering, similar to the research trap. But there is a key difference. You are not actually looking for facts. You are looking for permission. You want someone else to tell you that the choice you're leaning toward is the right one, so that if it goes wrong, some part of the responsibility can be shared, and so that in the meantime, you can feel the temporary relief of having outsourced the discomfort of choosing. The problem with this pattern is twofold. First, you will almost never get unanimous agreement, because different people carry different values, different fears, and different life experiences, and they will naturally project those onto your situation. One person will encourage you to take the risk, another will warn you against it, a third will suggest a completely different option you hadn't even considered. Instead of clarity, you end up with a pile of contradictory opinions. And now, in addition to your original decision, you also have to somehow reconcile all of these outside voices, which only adds more noise to a mind that was already struggling to hear itself. This contradiction is not a coincidence. It is inevitable, because the people you ask are not answering from inside your life. They are answering from inside theirs. The friend who tells you to play it safe may be speaking from their own past disappointment with risk. The friend who tells you to go for it may be speaking from their own regret about a chance they never took. Neither of them is lying to you, and neither of them is wrong exactly. They are simply offering you a reflection of their own history rather than genuine insight into your specific situation. When you collect enough of these reflections, what you end up holding is not a clearer picture of your decision. It is a mosaic of other people's unresolved experiences, and trying to make a decision by averaging that mosaic together will almost never produce something coherent. Second, and more importantly, even in the rare case where everyone does agree, that agreement does not actually protect you from the discomfort of an uncertain outcome. If the decision turns out badly despite everyone's approval, you will still have to live with the consequences yourself. The approval you sought does not transfer the ownership of the outcome. It only creates the illusion that you are not fully responsible, and illusions do not hold up well under the weight of real life. When it becomes clear that you are the one living inside the results of the decision, the approval you gathered beforehand will feel meaningless. This trap often has roots that go back further than the immediate decision in front of you. Many people who fall into the approval trap grew up in environments where their choices were closely monitored, criticized, or corrected. Environments where deviating from what was expected carried a real emotional cost. In that context, learning to check with others before acting was not irrational, it was adaptive. It kept you safe from disapproval that genuinely mattered at the time. But what was once a smart adaptation to a specific environment often outlives its usefulness and becomes a default setting that quietly runs your adult decision-making long after the original threat is gone. Breaking free from the approval trap does not mean cutting yourself off from other people's input entirely. It means changing the purpose of that input. Instead of asking others to validate your decision, ask them to sharpen your thinking. There is a meaningful difference between asking, "Do you think I should do this?" and asking, "What am I not seeing here?" The first question hands your judgment over to someone else. The second question keeps your judgment in your own hands while still benefiting from another perspective. Over time, as you practice keeping the final call with yourself, you will notice that the compulsive need to check with everyone before moving begins to loosen, and in its place grows something steadier, a willingness to stand behind your own choices, even the ones nobody else fully understands. It is also worth noticing how the approval trap tends to target a specific kind of decision more than others. The decisions that deviate even slightly from what is expected of you. Choosing the safe, conventional, widely approved option rarely triggers the same anxious need for validation, because that option already comes pre-approved by the culture around you. Nobody polls a dozen people before accepting a stable job with a good salary. The approval trap activates most strongly precisely when you are considering something unconventional, something that might invite raised eyebrows or quiet disapproval, which is exactly why it so often ends up steering people away from the paths that would have been most meaningful to them and back toward the paths that are simply the most socially frictionless. If you notice that you only seek excessive validation for the choices that feel most authentically yours, that pattern itself is worth paying attention to. There is a difference between healthy accountability and the approval trap that deserves to be named clearly, because the two can look similar from the outside. Healthy accountability means sharing a decision with someone you trust after you have already done the internal work of deciding, so that they can offer perspective, support, or a reality check grounded in care for you specifically. The approval trap means outsourcing the decision itself, using other people's reactions as the primary mechanism for determining what you should do. One strengthens your judgment over time. The other slowly erodes it. Because every time you let someone else's opinion override your own read of a situation, you reinforce the belief that your own read cannot be trusted. And that belief, reinforced enough times, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Chapter 5. The Perfection Delay. The third trap is the one that most explicitly disguises itself as high standards. And because of that, it is often the hardest one for capable, conscientious people to recognize in themselves. We will call this the perfection delay. And it is the belief that a decision should not be made until every risk has been eliminated, every variable accounted for, and every possible negative outcome fully prevented. It sounds admirable. It sounds like the mark of someone who takes things seriously. In reality, it is one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that nothing ever gets decided at all. The uncomfortable truth that the perfection delay refuses to accept is that no decision of any real significance comes with a guarantee of a perfect outcome. Every meaningful choice carries some degree of risk, some possibility of a version of events you did not intend and would not have chosen if you could see the future clearly. This is true of the safest sounding option just as much as the boldest one, because even staying still, even choosing not to choose, carries its own risks, its own costs, its own version of things that can go wrong. There is no path through life that avoids risk entirely. There is only the choice of which risks you are willing to accept. People caught in the perfection delay often tell themselves a very specific story. Something like, "I just need a little more certainty before I move." But certainty is not a resource you can accumulate like savings in a bank account. It does not build up the longer you wait. In fact, the opposite often happens. The longer a decision sits unmade, the more pressure and emotional weight it accumulates, and the harder it becomes to finally act. Because now, the decision is not just about the original choice, it's also tangled up with the anxiety, the self-criticism, and the sunk time of everything that came before it. Consider how this plays out with something as ordinary as starting a new habit or a new project. Someone wants to begin exercising regularly, but tells themselves they will start once they have the perfect schedule figured out, once they've researched the ideal program, once their current stressful period at work has passed. Someone wants to start creating content, but tells themselves they need better equipment first, a clearer niche, more confidence on camera. In both cases, the underlying belief is the same, that action should only begin once the conditions are ideal. But ideal conditions are a fantasy that conveniently keeps arriving in the future, always just out of reach, always one more preparation away. The way through the perfection delay is to deliberately lower the bar for what qualifies as a legitimate starting point. Instead of asking, "Is this decision guaranteed to work out?" ask instead, "Is this decision reasonable, reversible, where possible, and aligned with what I actually value?" Most decisions, even significant ones, are far more adjustable after the fact than the anxious mind wants to admit. Careers can be changed again. Relationships can be renegotiated. Plans can be revised. Very few choices in ordinary life are the permanent, unchangeable, one-shot events that the perfection delay imagines them to be. Recognizing this does not mean treating decisions carelessly. It means treating them with the accurate amount of weight instead of an inflated, fear-driven amount of weight. There is a kind of freedom that comes from accepting imperfection as the price of admission for actually living your life instead of just preparing for it. The people who accomplish meaningful things are rarely the ones who waited until they felt completely ready, because that feeling, in its complete form, essentially never arrives. They are the ones who decided that reasonably ready was enough, that a solid plan built on real but incomplete information was enough, and that whatever gaps remained could be handled as they appeared, through adjustment, through learning, through the same resourcefulness that got them to the decision in the first place. That is the shift you are being asked to make here. Not from careless to careful, but from paralyzed to willing, from waiting for guarantees to trusting your own capacity to handle whatever comes next. It is worth examining where the perfection delay tends to come from, because for many people, it is not simply a personality trait. It is a learned response to a past mistake that carried real pain. Somewhere along the way, a decision went badly, and the consequences were significant enough that the mind quietly concluded, "I must never let that happen again." And the way it tries to enforce that promise is by demanding total certainty before allowing any future action of similar weight. This is an understandable response, but it is built on a flawed premise. No amount of pre-decision analysis can actually prevent every possible bad outcome, because bad outcomes are not always the result of insufficient planning. Sometimes they are simply the result of factors nobody could have reasonably predicted. Holding yourself to a standard of preventing all possible pain through sufficient forethought is holding yourself to a standard that was never achievable in the first place, and continuing to chase it only guarantees a different kind of pain. The slow, quiet pain of a life spent waiting on the sidelines. The antidote to this particular root cause is not more courage in the abstract sense. It is building a different relationship with the idea of making mistakes. A person who has made peace with the fact that some decisions will not work out as planned, and who trusts themselves to handle that outcome if it comes, no longer needs perfect certainty before moving, because the entire reason certainty felt so necessary was the belief that a wrong decision would be unbearable. Once you know, through evidence from your own life, that you have survived wrong turns, before, adjusted, learned, and kept going, the pressure to eliminate all risk before acting begins to soften. You stop needing the guarantee, because you no longer believe the absence of a guarantee is something you cannot handle. Chapter 6. The Cost of Standing Still. There is a story overthinkers tell themselves that sounds comforting on the surface, but is actually one of the most costly lies in this entire pattern. The story goes something like this. If I don't decide, at least I haven't made things worse. Staying in the same place, keeping all options open, refusing to commit. This feels like a neutral position, a kind of safety in suspension. But standing still is not neutral. Standing still is a decision with its own consequences, and those consequences are often larger and more damaging than the consequences of simply choosing and being wrong. Think about what actually happens while you are frozen at a decision point. Time does not pause and wait politely for you to figure things out. The job market keeps moving. The person you were interested in keeps living their life, and may very well move on to someone who was willing to show up. The business idea you keep refining in your head instead of testing in the real world gets built by someone else, who was less careful but more willing to act. Every day you remain undecided is a day where the world continues to shift around you. Sometimes closing doors you didn't even realize were open. Sometimes making the eventual decision harder than it would have been if you had simply acted when the option was fresh. There is also an internal cost, one that is harder to measure but just as real. Every time you face a decision and fail to act on it, you are quietly teaching yourself something about who you are. You are reinforcing a self-image of someone who hesitates, someone who cannot be trusted with their own choices, someone who needs endless deliberation before doing anything meaningful. This self-image does not stay contained to one decision. It becomes the lens through which you approach every future decision, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you avoid deciding, the more you confirm to yourself that you are someone who avoids deciding, and the harder it becomes to break that pattern the next time a choice appears. Contrast this with what happens when you make a decision and act on it, even an imperfect one. Something shifts internally. You begin to build evidence, real, lived evidence, that you are someone capable of moving forward under uncertainty. This evidence compounds over time. Each decision you make and follow through on, regardless of whether it turns out exactly as planned, adds another data point to your internal record of who you are. Eventually, that record becomes strong enough that the next decision does not feel as terrifying, because you are no longer approaching it as someone with no track record of trusting themselves. You are approaching it as someone who has already proven, repeatedly, that they can handle whatever comes from a choice. This compounding effect works in both directions, and it is worth being honest about that. Just as each decisive action builds momentum toward more decisive action, each avoided decision builds momentum toward more avoidance. The mind is in many ways, simply a pattern recognition machine applied to itself, constantly updating its model of what kind of person you are based on what you actually do, not based on your intentions or your self-image. If your actions over months and years consistently demonstrate hesitation, that becomes the operating model your mind uses going forward, regardless of how much you privately wish you were more decisive. This is not meant as discouragement. It is meant as clarity about how the shift actually happens. It happens through accumulated action, not through a single moment of insight or motivation, which is precisely why the practical tools in the chapters ahead matter so much more than simply understanding the problem intellectually. There is a particular kind of grief that comes later in life for people who spent years in the paralysis of overthinking. A grief not for the wrong choices they made, but for all the choices they never made at all. Wrong choices, painful as they can be, at least produce a story, a lesson, a version of you that exists and can be built upon. Choices never made produce nothing. They leave behind an absence, a wondering, a permanent uncertainty about what might have happened if you had simply moved when the moment called for it. This is often far more painful in retrospect than any specific bad outcome could have been, because a bad outcome eventually becomes part of your history, something you survived and grew from, while an unmade choice remains forever unresolved, a question mark that can never be answered. This is why so many people, when asked to reflect honestly on their biggest regrets, do not point to the risks they took that failed. They point to the risks they never took at all. The conversation never had, the opportunity never pursued, the version of themselves never given the chance to exist, because the decision required to bring that version into being was endlessly postponed, until postponement simply became the permanent answer by default. There is a particular kind of quiet sorrow in realizing, sometimes decades later, that an entire possible life went unlived, not because it was tried and failed, but because it was never attempted at all. And that sorrow tends to weigh far heavier over time than the sting of any single wrong turn ever could. Understanding the true cost of standing still is meant to do one specific thing here: shift the way you weigh your options. Overthinkers instinctively compare the risk of acting against an imagined risk-free alternative of waiting. But that comparison is false. Waiting has its own risks, its own costs, its own potential for regret. Once you start weighing the real cost of inaction against the real cost of action, rather than against an imaginary zero-risk alternative, the decision to move forward starts to look a great deal more reasonable than it did when you were only looking at one side of the scale. Consider the way opportunity actually behaves in the real world, because it rarely waits patiently for you to feel ready. Most meaningful opportunities, whether they involve a job, a relationship, an investment, or a creative project, exist within a window, and that window is shaped by forces entirely outside your control. Other people are also making decisions. Markets are shifting. Circumstances are evolving. While you are running the same considerations through your mind for the 15th time, the actual conditions that made the opportunity attractive in the first place may already be quietly changing. This is why so many people look back on missed opportunities and realize, often too late, that the version of the choice they eventually would have made no longer exists in the same form, because the world did not hold still and wait for their internal deliberation to conclude. There is also a subtler cost worth naming: the cost to your relationships with the people around you. Chronic indecision does not only affect you, It affects everyone who is waiting on your choice, whether that is a partner wondering where a relationship stands, a team waiting on a decision that affects their work, or a friend hoping for a simple answer to a simple invitation. Over time, people notice this pattern, and even if they never say it directly, it shapes how much they trust you with decisions, how much they include you in plans that require timely answers, how much weight they place on your word when you do eventually commit to something. Becoming known as someone who can actually decide is not a minor social advantage. It is a form of trustworthiness that other people quietly value and reward, just as chronic hesitation is a pattern other people quietly notice and adjust their expectations around. Chapter 7. Trusting your gut without losing your mind. One of the reasons overthinkers struggle to trust their instincts is that instinct has been given a bad reputation, treated as something reckless, something opposed to careful thinking, something only impulsive people rely on. But this framing misses what intuition actually is. Genuine gut instinct is not a random impulse. It is the output of a mind that has quietly processed an enormous amount of information, pattern, experience, and context, faster than your conscious reasoning can articulate, and delivered a conclusion in the form of a feeling rather than a fully worked-out argument. Learning to trust that feeling, appropriately and selectively, is one of the most valuable decision-making skills you can develop. The key word there is appropriately, because not every internal signal deserves the same level of trust. There is a meaningful difference between intuition and anxiety, even though they can feel remarkably similar in the body, both showing up as tension, urgency, a sense that something needs attention. The way to tell them apart is to pay attention to their texture rather than their intensity. Anxiety tends to be repetitive, circular, focused on worst-case scenarios, and it tends to grow louder the more you sit with a decision rather than settling. Intuition tends to be quieter, steadier, and it tends to point toward a direction rather than simply generating fear about every direction equally. Anxiety asks, "What if this goes wrong?" over and over. Intuition tends to say something closer to, "This feels right," or "This feels off," and then it does not need to keep repeating itself to be heard. Building trust in your own gut is not something that happens through a single insight. It happens through practice. The same way trust in another person is built through a track record of small moments rather than one grand gesture. Start with lower stakes decisions, the kind where a wrong choice costs you very little. Notice your first instinct before you let your mind spiral into analysis. Then act on that instinct, and afterward, take note of how it played out. Over time, across dozens and then hundreds of these small experiments, you begin to build real, evidence-based confidence in your own read of situations rather than a vague hope that your instincts might be reliable. This process mirrors, in many ways, how trust gets built in any relationship, including the relationship you have with yourself. You would not expect to trust a new acquaintance completely after a single interaction, and you should not expect to trust your own gut completely without first giving it the chance to demonstrate its reliability across a range of situations. What often happens instead, for chronic overthinkers, is a kind of premature abandonment, where the gut is asked to prove itself perfectly on the very first attempt, and any imperfection is treated as final proof that it cannot be trusted at all. This is an unreasonably high bar, one you would never apply to any other skill you were trying to develop. Learning to trust your instincts like learning any capability, requires tolerating an early period of imperfect results while the underlying skill continues to sharpen through repetition. There is also a practice worth adopting here, something you might call the first response check. Before you allow yourself to begin the full analytical process on a decision, pause and notice what your immediate, pre-analysis reaction actually was. Write it down if that helps, or simply hold it clearly in your mind. Then proceed with whatever careful thinking the decision genuinely requires. When you reach the end of that process, compare your final conclusion against your original first response. You will often find that after all the deliberation, all the pro and con lists, all the outside opinions, you have landed right back where your gut told you to land in the first place. Except now, you have spent hours of anxious energy getting there, instead of simply trusting the signal you already had. None of this means abandoning careful thought altogether. Some decisions genuinely benefit from analysis, particularly ones involving unfamiliar domains where you lack the experience needed for reliable intuition. The goal is not to replace thinking with feeling in every circumstance. The goal is to recognize which decisions actually require extended analysis and which ones are simply being subjected to analysis out of habit, out of fear, out of a learned distrust of your own judgment. As you build the skill of distinguishing between these two categories, you will find that a great deal of what used to feel like a necessary, careful process was actually just anxiety dressed up as diligence, delaying a conclusion your gut had already reached long before your conscious mind caught up to it. It is worth addressing directly why so many people learn to distrust their gut in the first place. Because this distrust rarely appears out of nowhere. Often, it traces back to specific moments where following an instinct led to a painful outcome. And the mind, doing what minds do, drew an oversized conclusion from a limited set of data points. One bad outcome from trusting a gut feeling can convince a person that their intuition is fundamentally unreliable, when in reality, intuition, like any skill, has an error rate that improves with calibration and honest feedback over time. Dismissing your intuition entirely after a handful of missteps is a bit like refusing to ever walk again after a single fall as a toddler. The instrument itself is not broken. It simply needs more practice and more honest observation of its actual track record, most of which likely includes far more accurate reads than the memorable failures your mind tends to fixate on. There is a specific exercise worth trying if you want to rebuild this trust more deliberately. At the end of each day for several weeks, briefly recall any moments where you had a clear gut sense about something, whether it involved a person, a decision, or a situation, and note privately whether that instinct turned out to be accurate. Do this without judgment, simply as observation. Most people who complete this exercise honestly are surprised to discover that their gut instincts were right far more often than their anxious, overthinking mind gave them credit for. The anxious mind tends to remember the rare instances of being wrong vividly, while quietly forgetting the far more numerous instances of being right, because being right did not generate the same emotional intensity worth remembering. Correcting this skewed memory through deliberate tracking is one of the fastest ways to rebuild genuine, evidence-based trust in your own instincts. This exercise also has a secondary benefit worth mentioning, which is that it slowly shifts your general orientation toward your own internal experience. Instead of treating every feeling as something to be second-guessed argued with, or overridden by external opinion. You begin treating your inner signals as a legitimate and often reliable source of information, deserving of the same basic respect you might extend to a trusted advisor. This does not mean your gut becomes infallible. No source of information ever is. But it does mean you stop starting from a position of automatic self-distrust every time a decision appears. That shift in starting position, from doubt as default to curiosity as default, changes the entire emotional texture of decision-making, making it feel less like an interrogation and more like a genuine, collaborative conversation between your instincts and your reasoning mind. Chapter 8. The 2-minute rule for small decisions. Not every decision deserves the same weight, and one of the quiet ways overthinking sustains itself is by treating small, low-stakes decisions with the same intensity as major, life-altering ones. This is exhausting, and it also trains your mind to associate decision-making in general with anxiety and effort, which makes even simple choices start to feel like a burden. The first practical tool for interrupting this pattern is what we will call the 2-minute rule. A simple, almost embarrassingly straightforward practice that produces outsized results once you actually apply it consistently. The rule is this: for any decision where a wrong choice would cost you very little, where the consequences are minor, reversible, or forgettable within a week, give yourself a hard limit of 2 minutes to decide. Not 2 hours of consideration disguised as 2 minutes of final confirmation. An actual 2-minute window from the moment the decision appears to the moment you act on it. What to order at a restaurant. Which of 2 similar emails to send first. Whether to take the highway or the side street. Which show to watch tonight. These decisions do not deserve extended deliberation, and yet, for a practiced overthinker, they often receive it anyway, simply because the mind does not distinguish well between stakes unless it is trained to. The value of this rule is not really about the 2 minutes themselves. It is about breaking the automatic reflex that treats every decision as a candidate for extended analysis. Each time you successfully apply the 2-minute rule and move on with your day, you are sending a signal to your own nervous system that not every choice requires vigilance, that you can decide quickly and survive the outcome just fine. This rewires the underlying association over time. Instead of decision equals danger requiring extensive deliberation, you begin building a new default. Decision equals a normal, frequent part of daily life that does not require a state of alarm. A helpful way to apply this in the moment is to ask yourself a single filtering question the instant you notice hesitation building around a small choice. Will this matter in a week? If the honest answer is no, you have your permission to apply the 2-minute rule immediately, without guilt, without a sense that you are being careless. You are not being careless. You are being appropriately calibrated to the actual stakes of the situation, which is something many overthinkers have simply never practiced because their default setting treats all uncertainty as equally threatening regardless of what is actually at risk. It is worth pointing out how much collective time this single filtering question can reclaim over the course of a year. If you consider how many small, low-stakes decisions the average person encounters across a single day, what to wear, what to eat, which task to start first, how to phrase a casual message, the number is often surprisingly high. Sometimes dozens of small forks in the road before lunch alone. For someone caught in the overthinking pattern, even a fraction of these decisions consuming a few extra minutes of anxious deliberation adds up to a substantial amount of mental energy lost over the course of a week, a month, a year. Energy that could otherwise be directed toward the handful of decisions that genuinely deserve careful thought, or simply toward being present in your own life, instead of narrating it anxiously from the sidelines. It also helps to notice, after using this rule repeatedly, just how rarely the outcome of a small, quickly made decision actually causes any real harm. You ordered the dish that turned out to be just okay instead of great. You took the route that had slightly more traffic. You watched the show that wasn't quite as good as the other option. None of these outcomes meaningfully damaged your life. And yet, before adopting a rule like this, decisions of this size may have previously consumed disproportionate amounts of your mental energy. Seeing, again and again, that quick decisions on low stakes matters produce perfectly survivable results, builds a kind of foundational confidence that eventually makes it easier to extend the same trust to bigger, more consequential choices as well. There is a compounding effect to this practice that deserves attention, because the benefit is not limited to the specific small decisions where you apply it. Every time you successfully make a fast, low-stakes decision without spiraling, you are strengthening a general mental muscle, the muscle of decisive action under mild uncertainty. This muscle does not know the difference between deciding what to eat and deciding something slightly more significant. It simply gets stronger or weaker based on how often it is exercised. An overthinker who has spent years avoiding quick decisions on even trivial matters has effectively let this muscle atrophy almost completely, which is part of why even moderately important decisions can feel so disproportionately difficult. Rebuilding that muscle through dozens of small, low-stakes repetitions each week creates a foundation of decisiveness that naturally extends outward into larger areas of life, the same way physical strength built through consistent small exercises eventually supports larger, more demanding movements. It can also help to notice the specific bodily sensation of hesitation the moment it arises around a small decision, because naming it in real time interrupts the automatic spiral before it gathers momentum. A brief internal acknowledgement, something as simple as noticing there is the pull to overanalyze this, creates just enough distance between you and the impulse to give the 2-minute rule a real chance to work. Without that moment of recognition, the mind often slides into extended deliberation before you even consciously register that a small decision has quietly turned into a much bigger production than it needed to be. There is one more dimension worth mentioning, which is the way small, decisive actions ripple outward into your sense of daily momentum. A day spent making a series of quick, confident, low-stakes decisions tends to feel fundamentally different from a day spent hesitating over the same category of choices, even if the actual content of the day is otherwise similar. The person who decided quickly what to wear, quickly what to eat, quickly how to respond to a routine message, carries a subtle sense of forward motion into everything else they do that day. The person who agonized over each of these same small choices carries a subtle undercurrent of friction and fatigue instead, even before reaching whatever the actual important task of the day happens to be. Applying the 2-minute rule consistently is, in this sense, not just about reclaiming time. It is about protecting the quality and momentum of your entire day from being quietly drained by decisions that were never worth the weight they were given. Chapter 9. The 10-10-10 Method for Bigger Decisions. While small decisions benefit from speed, larger decisions genuinely deserve a bit more structure. Though not the endless, unstructured spiraling that overthinkers default to. What bigger decisions need is a framework that provides enough perspective to make a grounded choice without allowing the process to expand indefinitely. One of the most effective tools for this is a method you can think of as the 10-10-10 approach, a simple set of 3 questions that force your mind to consider a decision across multiple time frames, rather than getting stuck inside the emotional intensity of the present moment alone. The first question is this: how will I feel about this decision in 10 minutes? This question captures your immediate emotional reaction, the raw, present tense response to the choice in front of you. This matters, but on its own, it is often unreliable, because 10 minutes from now, you may still be flooded with the anxiety or excitement of the moment, and that emotional intensity can distort your judgment in either direction, making a decision feel more urgent or more terrifying than it actually is in the broader context of your life. The second question widens the lens. How will I feel about this decision in 10 months? This question forces you to imagine a version of yourself who has had time to live with the consequences, who has adjusted, adapted, and settled into whatever reality followed the choice. Many decisions that feel enormous in the present moment shrink considerably when viewed from this distance. A difficult conversation that feels terrifying right now will, in 10 months, likely be a distant, mostly forgotten moment, regardless of how it went. A financial choice that feels risky today will, in 10 months, have either proven itself reasonable or revealed a problem you can address, neither of which is the catastrophe your anxious mind may currently be imagining. This 10-month checkpoint is particularly useful because it sits in a kind of middle ground that the anxious mind often skips entirely. Left to its own devices, an overthinking mind tends to oscillate between the overwhelming intensity of the immediate present and vague, poorly defined worries about the distant future, without spending much time genuinely imagining the medium term, the realistic, ordinary stretch of time during which most of the initial emotional intensity of a decision naturally fades and daily life simply continues. Deliberately picturing this medium-term checkpoint interrupts that oscillation and grounds your thinking in a more realistic sense of how life actually unfolds after a decision is made, which is almost always far less dramatic than the anticipation beforehand suggested it would be. The third question extends the lens even further. How will I feel about this decision in 10 years? This is often the most clarifying question of the 3, because it strips away nearly all of the noise and leaves only what genuinely matters over the long arc of a life. 10 years from now, will this decision be a meaningful turning point you're grateful for, a minor detail you barely remember, or a regret you still carry? This question is particularly useful for surfacing decisions that overthinking tends to inflate far beyond their actual long-term significance. A huge percentage of the choices that trigger intense spirals in the present moment turn out, from the vantage point of 10 years, to have mattered far less than they felt like they mattered at the time. Using this method does not mean mechanically answering 3 questions and expecting a perfect answer to fall out automatically. It means using the 3 different time frames to notice where your fear is concentrated. If a decision feels unbearable at the 10-minute mark, but genuinely inconsequential at the 10-year mark, that gap tells you something important, namely that you are likely dealing with present-moment anxiety rather than a decision with real long-term stakes, and that recognition alone is often enough to loosen the grip overthinking has on that particular choice. Conversely, If a decision feels uncomfortable across all three timeframes, that consistency is meaningful too, and it tells you this is a decision that genuinely deserves careful, deliberate thought rather than a quick 2-minute resolution. It is worth walking through a concrete example to see how this actually plays out in practice. Imagine someone deciding whether to have a difficult conversation with a family member about a long-standing issue. At the 10-minute mark, the anticipation feels almost unbearable. The stomach tightens, the mind races through every way the conversation could go badly. At the 10-month mark, picture the same person having already had the conversation, having navigated whatever discomfort came with it, and having likely moved into some new, more honest version of that relationship, whether smoother or still being worked out. At the 10-year mark, picture looking back on that conversation as one moment among many in a long relationship, likely remembered, if at all, as a turning point that mattered far less in isolation than it felt like it would in the anxious moment beforehand. Walking through this progression deliberately, rather than staying stuck in the 10-minute view alone, often reveals that the immediate fear was carrying far more weight than the actual long-term stakes justified. This method becomes even more powerful when you apply it consistently rather than only reaching for it during moments of acute crisis. Building a habit of running any moderately significant decision through this three-part lens, even briefly, trains your mind to automatically consider a wider time frame rather than defaulting to the narrow, intensely emotional present moment view that fuels most overthinking spirals in the first place. Over time, this habit changes not just how you handle individual decisions, but how you generally relate to uncertainty. Because you are no longer relying solely on the loudest, most immediate emotional signal to determine how seriously a decision deserves to be taken. It is also worth pairing this method with a brief written record, especially in the beginning, while you are still building the habit. A short note capturing your honest answer to each of the three questions kept somewhere you can return to later does two valuable things. First, the act of writing forces a level of honesty and specificity that purely internal reflection often lacks, since vague, anxious thoughts are much harder to sustain once you have to put them into concrete words on a page. Second, and just as valuable, revisiting these notes after the 10-month or 10-year mark has actually passed gives you direct, personal evidence of how accurately your anxious predictions matched reality. Most people who do this consistently discover a clear and humbling pattern that their anxious mind tends to dramatically overestimate the emotional weight a decision will still carry once real time has passed. And seeing this pattern documented in your own handwriting, drawn from your own life, tends to be far more convincing than any amount of abstract reassurance ever could be. Chapter 10. Making Peace with Being Wrong Sometimes. Underneath almost every overthinking spiral sits a single, largely unexamined belief. The belief that making a wrong decision would be catastrophic, unbearable, something you might not be able to recover from. This belief is rarely stated so plainly, but it operates quietly in the background, inflating the perceived stakes of ordinary choices and making the discomfort of uncertainty feel unbearable rather than simply uncomfortable. Until this belief is directly challenged and revised, no amount of practical technique will fully dissolve the pattern, because the underlying fear driving the spiral will simply find new ways to express itself. Here is the truth that belief conveniently ignores. You have already been wrong before, many times, about many things. And you survived every single instance. Some of those wrong decisions probably felt devastating in the moment. And yet here you are, having made it through, having adjusted, having learned, having continued building a life, despite the mistake, rather than being permanently destroyed by it. This is not a coincidence specific to you. It is simply how human resilience actually works. People are far more capable of absorbing, adapting to, and recovering from wrong decisions than their anxious minds predict in advance. The fear of being wrong is almost always more intense and more convincing than the actual lived experience of being wrong turns out to be. Part of making peace with this reality involves separating the concept of a wrong decision from the concept of a permanent, unrecoverable outcome. Most decisions, even significant ones, are far more reversible, or at least adjustable, than the anxious mind initially believes. A career path can be changed again. A living situation can be altered. A relationship pattern can be renegotiated or, if necessary, exited. Very few choices genuinely lock you into a single, unchangeable trajectory forever. When you begin evaluating decisions honestly for their actual reversibility, rather than assuming worst-case permanence by default, the emotional weight of choosing tends to lighten considerably because you are no longer treating every decision as a one-way door when most of them are actually doors you can walk back through if needed. A useful practice here is to explicitly sort decisions into two categories before allowing yourself to feel the full weight of a choice. The first category includes decisions that are genuinely difficult to reverse, the kind that deserve real thought and caution. The second, far larger category includes decisions that only feel irreversible because of the emotional intensity surrounding them in the moment, when, in practical reality, they can be revisited, adjusted, or undone with some effort if they turn out poorly. Chronic overthinkers tend to treat nearly every decision as though it belongs in the first category, which means they are constantly operating under a level of pressure that the actual situation rarely justifies. Simply and honestly asking, can this be changed later if needed, before allowing a decision to consume disproportionate anxiety, is one of the simplest and most effective habits you can build to correct this distortion. There is also real value in reframing what a wrong decision actually represents. Rather than viewing it purely as a failure, consider viewing it as information, data that simply was not available to you before you acted. You cannot gather certain kinds of information any other way except by making a choice and observing what happens. In this light, even a decision that does not turn out well is not wasted. It is the price of learning something that could not have been learned through additional analysis alone. The people who build genuinely successful, well-lived lives are rarely the ones who avoided every wrong decision. They are the ones who made peace with the fact that some decisions would not work out and who used those moments as material for growth, rather than evidence that they should never trust themselves to choose again. This chapter is not asking you to stop caring about outcomes or to approach decisions carelessly. It is asking you to recalibrate the emotional stakes you assign to being wrong, so that the fear of a mistake no longer holds disproportionate power over your ability to act. Once being wrong stops feeling like a catastrophe and starts feeling like a normal, survivable, even useful part of moving through life, the entire foundation that overthinking depends on begins to weaken. Fear cannot sustain the same grip on a mind that has genuinely made peace with the worst-case scenario it keeps imagining. There is a particular practice that can accelerate this process, something worth sitting with directly rather than skimming past. Take a moment to actually imagine, in detail, the worst realistic outcome of a decision you are currently avoiding. Not a vague sense of dread, but a specific, honest picture of what would actually happen if the decision went as badly as you fear. Then ask yourself, honestly, would I survive this? Would I still have people who care about me? Would I still be able to work, to rebuild, to try again? For the overwhelming majority of decisions people agonize over, the honest answer, once actually examined rather than left as a vague, looming shadow, is yes. You would survive it. You would be uncomfortable, disappointed, perhaps embarrassed for a while, and then you would adapt the way you always have before, naming the worst-case scenario explicitly. Rather than letting it remain a formless dread in the background, almost always shrinks it down to something far more manageable than it felt as an unexamined fear. It is also worth recognizing that the goal here is not to eliminate the discomfort of uncertainty entirely, because that discomfort will never fully disappear. It is simply part of being a person who makes choices in a world that cannot be fully predicted. The goal is to change your relationship with that discomfort, to stop treating its presence as a signal that something is wrong or that you are not ready, and to start treating it as simply the ordinary, expected sensation that accompanies any meaningful choice. Confidence, real confidence, is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the willingness to act while uncertainty is still present, trusting that you have the capacity to handle whatever unfolds afterward. That willingness is available to you right now, not after you achieve some future state of complete readiness, but in this moment, with whatever incomplete information and residual fear you are currently carrying. Chapter 11. Rewriting your decision-making identity. Everything covered so far has given you tools, ways of thinking, specific practices to interrupt the overthinking spiral in the moment. But tools alone, no matter how effective, tend to fade in their power if they are not eventually absorbed into something deeper, into your actual sense of who you are. This is the difference between someone who occasionally uses a technique to force themselves into a decision and someone who has genuinely become a decisive person. The first still identifies underneath it all as an overthinker who is managing their tendency. The second has quietly rewritten the underlying identity itself. And from that new identity, decisive action stops requiring so much conscious effort because it has become simply who they are rather than something they have to talk themselves into every single time. Identity is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, often more powerful than motivation, more powerful than willpower, more powerful than any specific technique. This is because identity operates as a kind of filter through which every decision gets processed, often below the level of conscious awareness. A person who believes, at their core, that they are indecisive will find countless small ways to confirm that belief. Hesitating a little longer than necessary, seeking a little more validation than the situation calls for, treating uncertainty as more threatening than it actually is, all without consciously deciding to behave this way. The behavior flows naturally from the identity because the mind is constantly, quietly working to keep your actions consistent with your self-concept, even when that self-concept is limiting rather than empowering. This means that lasting change requires more than simply applying techniques when a decision arises. It requires deliberately, repeatedly, acting in ways that are consistent with the identity you want to build, until that identity becomes the new default rather than an exception you have to consciously force. Every time you apply the 2-minute rule instead of spiraling, every time you trust your gut instead of seeking excessive approval, every time you accept a reasonable decision instead of demanding a perfect one, you are not just solving that individual decision, you are casting a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. A single vote does not change an identity, but a consistent pattern of votes, repeated across weeks and months, eventually does. Because identity is not something you declare once, it is something you build through the accumulated evidence of your own repeated actions. It is worth pointing out how this voting metaphor applies with particular force to the decisions that feel too small to matter. It is tempting to reserve the identity work for the big, obviously significant choices. Career moves, relationship milestones, major financial commitments, while treating small daily decisions as exempt, not worth the deliberate application of a new pattern. But identity is built disproportionately through repetition rather than through intensity, which means 20 small votes cast consistently over a month often shape your underlying self-concept more powerfully than a single large decision handled well but standing alone. The unglamorous, repetitive nature of small daily choices is precisely what makes them such fertile ground for identity change, because they offer far more frequent opportunities for practice than the rarer, larger decisions ever could. It can help to explicitly name the identity you are building toward, rather than leaving it as a vague aspiration. Instead of simply wanting to overthink less, picture a specific, concrete version of yourself, someone who receives information, considers it appropriately for the actual stakes involved, and then commits, someone whose word and whose choices can be relied upon, someone who treats uncertainty as a normal companion to meaningful action rather than as a reason to freeze. Give this version of yourself real texture in your mind. How do they carry themselves in a conversation where a decision needs to be made? How quickly do they respond when someone asks for their input? How do they speak about past decisions, including the ones that did not work out as planned? The more specific and vivid this picture becomes, the more useful it becomes as a reference point in real moments of hesitation. Because you can ask yourself directly, what would that version of me do right now? And let the answer guide your next action. There will be moments during this process where old patterns resurface, where you notice yourself sliding back into an extended analysis loop, or seeking unnecessary validation before a decision. This is not evidence that the identity shift has failed. It is simply evidence that old patterns, reinforced over years, do not disappear instantly the moment you decide to change. What matters is not whether the old pattern occasionally reappears, but how quickly you notice it and how consistently you choose to act from the new identity once you do notice it. Each time you catch yourself and redirect, you are strengthening the new identity a little further, and the old pattern, deprived of the repetition it needs to stay dominant, gradually loses its grip. There is a specific kind of language shift that tends to accompany a genuine identity change worth paying attention to in yourself. Someone still trapped in the old identity tends to describe themselves in fixed, permanent terms, saying things like, "I am just someone who overthinks everything," as though this were an unchangeable fact of their nature, rather than a pattern built through repetition. Someone in the process of genuine change begins speaking differently, describing overthinking as something they used to do, or a pattern they are actively working through, rather than a permanent label. Paying attention to how you describe yourself, out loud and internally, and deliberately shifting that language toward the identity you are building is a small but surprisingly powerful lever, because the words you use to describe yourself both reflect and reinforce the beliefs your mind treats as settled fact. It is worth adding that identity change rarely announces itself with a dramatic before and after moment. It tends to arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, revealed only in retrospect, when you realize that a decision which once would have consumed hours of anxious deliberation simply got made, cleanly, without the familiar spiral even showing up. People who have gone through this shift often describe a strange, almost anticlimactic feeling the first time they notice it. A sense of, wait, that's it. That was the whole decision. Where is the anguish I expected? That anticlimax is not a sign that something is missing. It is the sign that the identity has genuinely shifted, because a decisive person does not experience decisions as dramatic events requiring extended internal struggle. They simply experience them as decisions, handled and then released, making room for whatever comes next. There is also something worth saying about how this new identity interacts with your existing sense of self-worth. For many overthinkers, the exhausting deliberation was never purely about the decision at hand. It was tangled up with a deeper fear about what a wrong choice might reveal about their competence, their judgment, their worthiness of respect. Rewriting the decision-making identity, then, is not really a surface-level behavioral tweak. It is connected to a deeper, more stable sense that your worth is not actually on trial every time you make a choice. A decisive person can be wrong about a specific decision without that wrongness threatening their fundamental sense of who they are. And building that separation between the outcome of any single choice and your overall value as a person is part of what makes the entire identity shift sustainable over the long run, rather than another source of pressure to perform perfectly. Chapter 12. Applying this to relationships. Nowhere does overthinking cause quieter, more accumulated damage than in relationships, because relationship decisions rarely present themselves as single, dramatic moments. Instead, they show up as an ongoing stream of small choices, whether to bring up a concern or let it slide, whether to be honest about a feeling or soften it into something more palatable, whether to move a relationship forward or continue in an ambiguous holding pattern that never quite resolves into anything definite. Each of these small choices, handled through overthinking, can slowly erode the very connection the overthinking was meant to protect. Consider the pattern that plays out when someone drafts and redrafts a message to a partner or friend, trying to find the perfect wording that will guarantee no misunderstanding, no hurt feelings, no possibility of the conversation going badly. This effort feels considerate on the surface, but it often produces the opposite of its intended effect. Messages crafted through this kind of excessive deliberation frequently come across as stilted, overly careful, or strangely delayed, and the other person often senses the underlying anxiety, even if they cannot name it directly. Genuine connection tends to require a degree of unpolished honesty that overthinking instinctively wants to eliminate, replacing authentic communication with a carefully managed performance of communication instead. There is also the specific way overthinking shows up around conflict. Many people delay addressing a concern in a relationship for weeks or months, running the same conversation through their head repeatedly, imagining every possible negative reaction, waiting for a moment that feels sufficiently safe, or a version of the words that feels sufficiently perfect. During this delay, the unspoken concern does not simply sit still and wait patiently. It grows. Small irritations compound into resentment. What could have been a brief, honest exchange addressed early becomes, by the time it is finally raised, a much larger and more emotionally loaded conversation, precisely because the delay allowed the issue to accumulate weight it did not originally have. The paradox here is sharp. The overthinking that was meant to prevent relationship damage often ends up causing more damage than a slightly imperfect but timely conversation ever would have. Applying the tools from earlier chapters to relationships means, in practice, giving yourself permission to communicate imperfectly rather than waiting for perfect clarity or perfect timing. It means trusting that a slightly clumsy but honest expression of a feeling is almost always better received than prolonged silence followed by an eventual, overloaded confrontation. It means recognizing that most relationships can absorb far more honesty, disagreement, and imperfection than the anxious mind assumes, and that the primary threat to most relationships is not too much honesty delivered imperfectly, but too much unspoken tension accumulating in the silence created by chronic hesitation. This also applies to bigger relationship decisions, the ones involving commitment, direction, and long-term compatibility. People often spend years in a state of ambiguous uncertainty about a relationship, unwilling to either fully commit or honestly acknowledge that it is not working, because both paths require a decision that feels too weighty to make. But remaining in that ambiguous middle ground is itself a decision, one that quietly costs both people time, energy, and the opportunity to build something clearer, whether that clearer thing is a deeper commitment to each other or the space to find a better fit elsewhere. The same tools that help with smaller decisions, examining the actual reversibility of a choice, checking in with your gut rather than only external opinions, weighing the real cost of continued uncertainty against the discomfort of a clear decision, apply just as powerfully here, arguably more powerfully, given how much of your daily emotional life is shaped by the relationships you choose to build, sustain, or release. There is a specific kind of honesty worth naming that tends to get lost inside relationship overthinking. The honesty of simply naming your own uncertainty out loud rather than hiding it behind more analysis. Many people caught in relationship ambiguity believe their job is to privately resolve every doubt before saying anything to the other person, as though uncertainty itself was something shameful to be eliminated before it can be shared. But naming uncertainty directly, saying something as simple as, "I am still figuring out how I feel about this, and I want to be honest with you about that," is often far more respectful and far more relationship strengthening than a prolonged silence spent trying to arrive at false clarity alone. This kind of honesty invites the other person into the process rather than presenting them only with a fully formed, privately reached conclusion, and it tends to build the kind of trust that makes future difficult conversations easier rather than harder. It is also worth naming the particular way overthinking can show up as a form of quiet self-protection within relationships, a way of avoiding vulnerability by hiding behind endless deliberation, instead of simply stating a need or a boundary directly. Asking for what you want, or saying no to something that does not work for you, requires a moment of exposure, a moment where the other person's reaction is genuinely unknown. Overthinking offers an escape from that exposure, letting you stay in the safer, more controlled territory of internal analysis rather than the riskier, more honest territory of direct expression. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, a form of avoidance rather than genuine consideration, is often the first step toward choosing directness, even when it feels exposing, because the relationships built on that kind of honesty tend to be far sturdier than the ones maintained through careful, anxious management. This same dynamic shows up clearly in how people handle early-stage relationships, particularly the period of uncertainty before mutual interest has been clearly established. It is common to see someone analyze every text message from a new romantic interest with forensic intensity, searching for hidden meaning in word choice, response time, punctuation, treating the interaction as a puzzle to be solved rather than simply a developing connection to be experienced. This kind of analysis rarely produces the clarity it promises, because human communication, especially in its early, tentative stages, is not actually a precise code waiting to be decrypted. It is messy, inconsistent, shaped by factors that have nothing to do with genuine interest. A busy day, a distracted mood, an unrelated stress, treating early connection as something to be decoded through exhaustive analysis, rather than something to be discovered through continued honest interaction, often creates more anxiety than clarity, and can subtly push away the very connection someone is trying so carefully to protect. Family relationships deserve a brief mention here as well, because they often carry some of the oldest, most deeply grooved overthinking patterns a person has, shaped by years of learning what kept the peace or avoided disapproval within that specific family system. Decisions about how much time to spend with family, how to handle a recurring point of tension, or whether to set a boundary around a long-standing dynamic often trigger a version of the approval trap that runs deeper and older than almost any other context. Applying the same principles here, trusting your own read of what is healthy and sustainable for you, recognizing that a family relationship, like any other, can typically absorb more honesty than the anxious mind assumes, and accepting that not every family member will approve of every boundary you set, extends the same freedom you are building in other areas of life into what is often the most emotionally loaded relational territory of all. Chapter 13. Applying this to career and money. Career and financial decisions carry a particular kind of weight for overthinkers, because they often come bundled with concrete numbers, external judgment, and the sense that a wrong move could have lasting practical consequences. This makes them fertile ground for every trap covered earlier, the analysis loop that never runs out of additional data to consider, the approval trap that seeks endless outside validation before committing, and the perfection delay that waits for a guarantee of success that no career or financial choice can ever actually offer. Consider how this plays out with something as common as deciding whether to leave a stable but unfulfilling job for a new opportunity. The analysis loop shows up as endless research into the new company, the new industry, the new role, well past the point where additional research is actually changing the decision. The approval trap shows up as polling every friend, family member, and acquaintance for their opinion, collecting a pile of contradictory advice that adds confusion rather than clarity. The perfection delay shows up as waiting for some impossible guarantee that the new path will definitely work out better than the current one. A guarantee that simply does not exist in any career decision, no matter how much research precedes it. The tools from earlier chapters apply directly here. The 10-10-10 method is particularly useful for career decisions because it counters the tendency to fixate on the immediate discomfort of change while ignoring the medium and long-term picture. Sitting in an unfulfilling job might feel comfortable in the next 10 minutes, simply because it involves no immediate disruption. But examined honestly at the 10-month or 10-year mark, that same comfortable stability can reveal itself as a slow, quiet cost, accumulated dissatisfaction, skills left undeveloped, opportunities that continued closing while the decision remained unmade. Conversely, the discomfort of a career change might feel intense in the immediate moment, but at the 10-month or 10-year mark often reveals itself as a worthwhile trade for growth, learning, and a life that better reflects your actual values. This same lens applies powerfully to the decision of when to ask for a raise or seek new employment after feeling undervalued for an extended period. The immediate discomfort of that conversation or that job search feels acute and easy to postpone indefinitely, while the accumulated cost of staying underpaid or underutilized rarely announces itself as a single dramatic moment worth addressing urgently. It simply compounds quietly, year over year, in the form of lost income, lost skill development, and a gradually eroding sense of your own professional worth. Viewing this compounding cost honestly, rather than only weighing it against the sharp, immediate discomfort of initiating a difficult conversation, often reveals that the supposedly safer choice of continued silence is actually the more expensive path. Once the full timeline is taken into account, financial decisions benefit from similarly explicit reversibility assessment. Many financial choices that feel permanently binding in the anxious imagination are, in practical reality, far more adjustable than they initially appear. A financial commitment can often be renegotiated, refinanced, or exited with some cost, but without permanent catastrophe. Treating every financial decision as though it belongs in the small, genuinely irreversible category, when most actually belong in the far larger, adjustable category, inflates the emotional stakes of financial decision-making well beyond what the actual situation warrants. And that inflation is precisely what keeps so many capable, financially literate people stuck in analysis far longer than the decision actually requires. There is also a specific version of the approval trap that shows up intensely around money and career, driven by social comparison. Decisions about career and money often get filtered not just through personal fear, but through an imagined audience, an anticipated judgment from family, from peers, from a broader cultural sense of what a successful path is supposed to look like. This imagined audience can be one of the most powerful forces keeping a person stuck in a conventional but unfulfilling path, or conversely, keeping a person from choosing a stable path because it does not sound impressive enough to others. Recognizing when a career or financial decision is being shaped more by imagined external judgment than by your own honest values is a crucial step in reclaiming genuine ownership over decisions that will, ultimately, be lived entirely by you, regardless of what anyone else thinks about them from the outside. There is one more pattern worth naming here: the tendency to treat a single career or financial decision as though it is the only chance you will ever get, rather than one decision among many across a long working life. This inflated sense of a single, irreversible fork in the road adds enormous unnecessary pressure. In reality, Most careers unfold across decades and involve dozens of meaningful pivot points, not one singular, permanent choice made in your 20s or 30s that locks in the rest of your life. Approaching any individual career or financial decision with the understanding that it is one data point in a much longer unfolding story, rather than a final, defining verdict on your entire future, tends to lower the emotional stakes enough to allow for clearer, more grounded thinking, rather than the paralysis that comes from treating every choice as though the entire rest of your life depends on getting this one exactly right. It is also worth addressing the specific overthinking pattern that shows up around negotiation, whether negotiating a salary, a raise, a rate for freelance work, or the terms of a business deal. Many capable people avoid these conversations entirely, or enter them so over-prepared and over-analyzed that the natural, adaptive back and forth of genuine negotiation becomes stiff and mechanical. The underlying fear is usually the same one running through every trap covered so far. The fear of a single wrong word or wrong number producing an irreversible, catastrophic outcome. In reality, most negotiations are far more forgiving than this fear suggests, and the other party is usually far more focused on reaching a workable agreement than on judging every word choice with the same intensity you are applying to yourself internally. Trusting that a reasonably prepared, honest approach to a negotiation is enough, rather than demanding a flawlessly optimized script before you feel ready to begin, applies the same core lesson from this entire journey directly to one of the most anxiety-inducing corners of career and financial life. Money decisions in particular also benefit from a specific reframe worth adopting directly: the recognition that inaction around money is rarely actually neutral. Money left undecided, sitting in a low-yield account out of fear of making the wrong investment choice, a raise never asked for, out of fear of rejection, a beneficial financial change delayed indefinitely while searching for the perfect moment. All of these carry a real, quantifiable cost, even though that cost is invisible and easy to ignore precisely because it never shows up as a single dramatic loss. It accumulates instead through years of foregone growth and unclaimed opportunity, a slow leak rather than a sudden rupture. And slow leaks are exactly the kind of cost that overthinking is worst at recognizing, because there is no single painful moment to point to as evidence that waiting was actually the more expensive choice all along. There is also a specific pattern worth naming around asking for what you are worth at work, whether that means negotiating a starting salary, requesting a raise, or advocating for a promotion. This category of decision tends to trigger an especially intense version of the approval trap, because it combines financial stakes with a deep fear of how you will be perceived, worried about seeming greedy, ungrateful, or presumptuous. This fear often leads to years of under-earning relative to actual contribution, not because the request would have been unreasonable, but because the discomfort of making it felt larger than the cost of never making it at all. Recognizing that this particular discomfort, the brief awkwardness of an honest request, is almost always smaller and shorter-lived than the years-long cost of chronic under-earning, is one of the more financially consequential applications of everything covered throughout this journey. Chapter 14. The Discipline of Moving Forward Daily. Everything discussed so far is only useful to the extent that it becomes a practiced discipline, rather than an occasional insight remembered only in moments of crisis. Discipline, in this context, does not mean rigid perfection or an absence of struggle. It means a consistent, repeated commitment to acting according to what you have learned here, even on the days when the pull toward overthinking feels strong. Even when a particular decision feels genuinely uncomfortable, even when the old habitual pattern would be easier in the immediate moment than the new one you are building. One of the most practical ways to build this discipline is to create small, structured daily practices that reinforce decisive action, independent of whether a major decision happens to be present that day. This might mean deliberately using the 2-minute rule on every minor decision that arises throughout the day, treating it as a standing practice, rather than something you only remember when a decision feels difficult. It might mean a brief nightly reflection, similar to the gut instinct tracking exercise described earlier, reviewing the decisions made that day and noting where hesitation crept in unnecessarily. It might mean setting an explicit, honest deadline for any decision currently sitting unresolved, and holding yourself to that deadline the way you would hold yourself to a commitment made to someone else. It can also help to build a specific, concrete ritual around larger decisions, something that formally marks the transition from the deliberation phase into the committed action phase. This could be as simple as writing the decision down on paper, stating it out loud to yourself or to someone you trust, or taking one small, tangible first action immediately after deciding, something that makes the decision real, rather than leaving it as an internal conclusion that could still quietly dissolve back into further reconsideration. This kind of ritual matters more than it might initially seem, because one of the ways the old overthinking pattern reasserts itself is by treating a decision as provisional even after it has technically been made, allowing the mind to keep circling back and reopening a question that was supposed to be settled. A clear, deliberate marker of commitment helps close that loop firmly, signaling to your own mind that this particular decision has moved from the deliberation phase into the action phase, and further reconsideration is no longer necessary or productive. There is real value in treating decisiveness the way you might treat physical fitness, as a capacity that requires ongoing maintenance rather than something achieved once and then permanently possessed. Just as physical strength gradually declines without continued exercise, the mental muscle of decisive action can weaken again if it goes unused for extended periods, particularly during stressful seasons of life when the pullback toward old patterns tends to intensify. Building periodic check-ins with yourself, weekly or monthly, where you honestly assess how you have been handling decisions recently, helps catch any drift back toward overthinking before it becomes deeply entrenched again. It also helps enormously to have language ready for the moments when overthinking begins to resurface, rather than being caught off guard by it. A simple, practiced internal phrase, something like, "I have enough information," or "This is reversible," or "My gut already answered this," can interrupt a forming spiral far more effectively than trying to construct a fresh argument against anxiety in the heat of the moment. These phrases work best when they are chosen in advance, during a calm moment, and then rehearsed enough that they come to mind automatically when needed, the same way a well-trained response comes to mind automatically under pressure in any other skill. Finally, it is worth building in genuine compassion for the days when this discipline slips. There will be decisions where old patterns win, where you spiral longer than you would like, where you seek more approval than was necessary, where you delay past the point of reasonable caution. This does not undo the progress you have made. A single difficult day does not erase months of accumulated evidence that you are becoming a more decisive person. Treat these moments the same way you would treat a temporary setback in any other skill you are building. with honest acknowledgement, brief reflection on what triggered the slip, and a prompt return to practice, rather than with the kind of harsh self-criticism that so often becomes just another form of the same overthinking pattern. This discipline is meant to dismantle. There is also something to be said for environment here. Because discipline is rarely sustained through internal willpower alone, it is supported or undermined by the conditions surrounding it. If your days are filled with constant input, endless comparison through social feeds, a steady stream of other people's opinions and curated decisions, that environment will naturally pull you back toward the approval trap and the analysis loop, simply because it keeps feeding your mind more material to spiral around. Building small, deliberate boundaries around this input, a period of the day without external opinions competing for space in your head, a habit of deciding before consulting rather than consulting before deciding, gives the discipline described in this chapter a much better chance of actually taking root rather than constantly fighting against a current pulling in the opposite direction. It is also worth considering the specific role that rest and recovery play in sustaining this discipline over time, echoing what was discussed earlier about depletion and decision quality. A discipline that only accounts for effort and technique, while ignoring the underlying physical and emotional state required to actually execute that technique consistently, will eventually break down under the ordinary stresses of daily life. Protecting basic conditions, adequate sleep, reasonable stress management, moments of genuine rest rather than constant stimulation, is not a separate concern from decision-making discipline. It is a foundational part of it. A well-rested, reasonably regulated person will naturally find it far easier to apply the 2-minute rule, to trust their gut, to resist the pull of the approval trap, than a chronically depleted person trying to apply the same techniques through sheer force of will alone. There is one more practical structure worth mentioning, something you might think of as a weekly decision review. Once a week, take a few minutes to look back over the decisions, large and small, that you faced during that period. Note which ones you handled with the discipline described in this chapter, and which ones slid back into old patterns. This is not meant as an exercise in self-judgment, but as an honest, ongoing feedback loop, the same kind of feedback loop that improves performance in virtually every other skill worth developing. Over weeks and months, this simple review tends to reveal clear, encouraging trends. Fewer decisions handled through spiraling, more handled with clarity and speed. Concrete evidence that the discipline is genuinely taking hold, rather than remaining just an abstract intention. Chapter 15. Your new default. Everything you have gone through here comes down to a single, simple shift, though simple should not be mistaken for easy. The shift is this: moving from a default setting of hesitation to a default setting of trust. Trust in your own judgment. Trust in your ability to handle whatever outcome follows a decision. Trust that uncertainty is not a threat to be eliminated before acting, but a normal condition to act within. This shift does not happen instantly, and it does not happen through willpower alone. It happens the way every meaningful change happens, through repeated, deliberate practice, applied consistently until the new pattern becomes as automatic as the old one once was. Think back to where this began. That familiar late-night spiral, replaying a decision that has already been made or agonizing over one that still needs to be. That spiral does not need to define your relationship with decision-making for the rest of your life. It was never actually protecting you the way it claimed to be. It was simply an old, misapplied survival mechanism, amplified by traps like endless analysis, excessive approval-seeking, and the demand for impossible certainty, all of it compounding into a pattern that cost you far more than it ever gave you in return. You now understand exactly how that pattern operates, and more importantly, you have specific, practical tools for interrupting it, tools that work not through force, but through consistently giving your mind new evidence about what you are actually capable of. Every decision from here forward is an opportunity, not a threat. Every small choice handled quickly and confidently. Every larger choice examined through a clear framework, rather than an endless spiral. Every moment where you choose to trust your own read of a situation, instead of outsourcing that judgment to fear or to other people, adds another piece of evidence to the new identity you are building. This is not about becoming someone who never feels uncertain again. Uncertainty is permanent. It is simply part of being alive and engaged with a world that cannot be fully predicted. This is about becoming someone who can act fully and confidently in the presence of that uncertainty, rather than being controlled by it. The version of you who trusts themselves, who decides and moves forward, who treats mistakes as survivable and even valuable rather than catastrophic, is not some distant, unreachable ideal. That version of you is built through exactly the kind of ordinary, repeated choices available to you, starting with the very next decision you face. However small it might seem, you do not need to wait for a moment of dramatic transformation. You do not need permission from anyone else to begin. You simply need to take the next decision in front of you, apply what you now understand, and act. There is one final thing worth carrying with you beyond everything already covered. The goal was never to arrive at some permanent state of ease around every decision, free from all discomfort forever. That state does not exist, and chasing it would simply be another version of the same perfection delay this entire journey has been working to dismantle. The goal is far more grounded and far more achievable than that. It is simply to keep choosing, imperfectly, honestly, and consistently, to move rather than freeze, to trust rather than spiral, to accept the discomfort of not knowing rather than demanding a certainty life was never going to offer. Think about the specific kind of life this shift actually opens up, beyond the abstract idea of becoming more decisive. It is a life where opportunities are met with engagement rather than paralysis, where relationships are built on honest, timely communication rather than carefully managed silence, where a wrong turn becomes a source of learning rather than a permanent wound, where each day carries a sense of forward motion rather than the quiet, draining friction of decisions perpetually left unresolved. This is not a life without difficulty. Difficulty remains a constant feature of being alive, but it is a life where difficulty is met directly, handled, and moved through, rather than a life where difficulty is endlessly anticipated, rehearsed, and avoided without ever actually being resolved. Picture yourself a year from now, having genuinely applied what has been covered here. Not perfectly. Nobody applies anything perfectly, but consistently enough that the pattern has meaningfully shifted. Picture the specific decisions that would have once consumed entire evenings of anxious replaying, now handled within minutes, released, and left behind. Picture the conversations you would have once endlessly rehearsed and delayed, now had honestly and promptly, clearing space for a relationship to actually grow rather than remain suspended in unresolved tension. Picture the opportunities you would have once let quietly pass by while still weighing your options, now met with timely, grounded action. This picture is not a fantasy reserved for some naturally decisive personality type you were not born with. It is simply what becomes available to anyone willing to practice the shift described throughout this journey, consistently, over time. Starting from wherever they currently stand, you already have everything required to begin this shift. Not in some future version of yourself, once you feel sufficiently ready, but exactly as you are right now, with whatever uncertainty and residual fear you are currently carrying. The traps have been named, the underlying mechanisms explained, the practical tools laid out clearly enough to apply immediately. What remains is simply the ongoing, unglamorous work of choosing, again and again, to act from this new understanding rather than retreating back into the old familiar spiral. That work does not require perfection. It only requires the next decision, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, each one a small, quiet vote for the version of yourself who trusts what they know, moves when it is time to move, and keeps building a life defined by forward motion rather than endless deliberation. That accumulation starts now, with whatever decision is waiting for you the moment this ends. There is one last idea worth carrying forward, perhaps the most important one of all. The relationship you have with your own decisions is, in many ways, the relationship you have with yourself. Every time you trust your judgment and act, you are telling yourself, in the clearest language available, that you are someone worth trusting. Every time you override that judgment with endless doubt, you are telling yourself the opposite, quietly, repeatedly, until that message becomes the default you carry into everything else. Choosing to practice decisiveness, then, is not simply a productivity technique or a way to save time on minor choices. It is one of the most direct ways available to rebuild a fundamental trust in yourself, a trust that extends far beyond any single decision and into how you experience your entire life. That is what has actually been at stake in everything covered here. And that is what becomes available to you, starting with whatever choice comes next.